Hey, what's up? Adam Lobo here from Adam Lobo TV. So this Poco F3 has gone against many smartphones in my comparison videos, where it went against the Xiaomi Mi 10T Pro, the Poco X3 GT, the Xiaomi 11T, and the Xiaomi 11 Lite 5G NE. And while each category came very close on the Poco F3, but this was still my overall pick. So now, in my typical Adam Lobo TV fashion, here's my in-depth comparison to help you make a purchase decision between the Poco F3 against the Realme GT Neo 2, since it is one of your requests on my YouTube community tab. Now, starting from the phone's hardware, in terms of the chipset, the Poco F3 comes with the Snapdragon 870 chipset, which is a 7nm process, and the Realme GT Neo 2 comes with the same Snapdragon 870 chipset, and yes, both phones are 5G phones. Then when it comes to using both of the phones daily, it really felt like they were siblings, where both felt nice to hold, where it had a perfect thin design and the right form factor, where the Realme were a tad bit heavier than the Poco, but not too extreme of a difference. But of course, the decision-making process really comes down to what kind of rear finish that you like, where the Realme GT Neo 2 had this very striking green color, which kind of reminds me of the BMW M4 color. Or if you rather have something a bit more on a lower profile like the Poco F3. Now, judging from how you see the whole entire studio, I'm sure you know that I love white, but I have to say that I really love the out of the ordinary color that Realme has gone with this phone. Now, you'll find the camera arrays on both phones placed at the top left with a rather medium-sized camera bump, so expect both phones to wobble if you place it on a surface and try to type on it. Now, as for the ports and buttons, looking down below, the arrangements for both phones are the same, where both phones have the dual SIM card slot with no micro SD card slot expansion option. Then the power button and the volume rockers are on the right for the Poco F3, which I prefer compared to having the volume rockers on the other side, like how it was on the Realme GT Neo 2. As simple tasks like taking photos of selfie just using a single thumb like this is way much easier than reaching out on the other side instead. Now yes, this placement of the buttons is a minor thing, but it does make a difference if you are using the phone a lot when it comes to taking photos and videos on a single hand. Then looking on top, while the Poco has a dedicated speaker over here as a placement for the secondary speaker, the Realme instead has the other speaker on the earpiece area. And yes, there will be a sound test later on for you to check out later on in this video. Then when it comes to the unlocking speeds for both phones, although the Poco F3 is using the side fingerprint sensor, which obviously unlocks faster, but the Realme GT Neo 2 also unlocks very quickly too, even though it has the in-display fingerprint sensor, which I do prefer this in-display fingerprint sensor compared to the button ones since it is more current in the smartphone industry. Now, looking at the displays, both had a stunning AMOLED display. Now, the Poco F3 had a tad bit larger screen, which is a 6.67-inch display compared to the 6.52 inches on the Realme GT Neo 2. Now, both has the same screen resolution at 1080p by 2400 pixels, and I love how there is the auto select refresh rate settings in order for the phone to adapt to the screen. And it's nice that both has the same peak brightness of a massive 1300 nits. Now, there's no doubt that both phones has a very good screen, where the only thing that I noticed is that if you compare both phones side to side, the Poco F3 has a little more saturation on videos on YouTube, even when both displays were set at the vivid settings. Then when it comes to watching videos on Netflix, here's where I found it a little weird. Because according to the Netflix app, there is a HDR playback on the Poco F3 and none on the Realme GT Neo 2, where both displays have HDR10 capabilities, so hopefully there is a software update on Netflix to support this issue. But another funny thing is that when I played the same movie side by side on Netflix, the Realme GT Neo 2 seems to be a bit brighter by default. And you can even increase the brightness even more compared to the Poco F3, where even it was increased at the highest brightness in the app, it still felt a little dim. Now the good news is that both phones are wide-wide L1 and has full HD playback resolution. which was really nice to know, but as seen in the HDR capabilities, there's none on the Realme GT Neo 2. Now, of course, since this is a comparison video, I had to tell you what exactly I found when comparing each videos. But I have to stress that when it comes to choosing both phones, I feel when it comes to the screen, you cannot go wrong with either. Next, onto the phone's cameras. The Poco F3's rear camera comes with a 48MP f1.8 aperture main lens and 8MP f2.2 ultra-wide lenses and a 5MP f2.4 macro lens. Then as for the Realme GT Neo 2, it has a bigger 64MP f1.8 aperture lens and 8MP f2.3 ultra-wide lenses and a 2MP f2.4 macro lens. Then as for the front cameras, the Poco F3 has a 20MP f2.5 lens, but the Realme GT Neo 2 has a 16MP f2.5 lens. Now, just so you all know, since the current monsoon weather is still going on here in Malaysia, so the images are not at the best of the outdoor lighting, especially with the skies getting pretty inconsistent at times. But I guess this would be a great way for us to see how the camera performs. Now, starting from the high megapixel mode, although the spec sheet shows that the Realme has a bigger megapixel count, as seen in these images, the image quality was pretty much the same even if you zoomed in really close. However, I preferred how the images look like on the Realme GT Neo 2, as the darker black levels were more prominent compared to a more washed out image on the Poco F3. Then images on the main lens were a bit brighter on the Realme, as this could be due to the higher megapixel sensor count, and while afar it does look very similar, but if you really pixel peep, there are areas of the shadows which had more details on the Realme GT Neo 2. And because there's more saturation on the image on the Realme, the images do look a little nicer straight out of the camera compared to a more washed out image on the Poco F3 once again. Then as for the zooming features, since there's no dedicated telephoto lens, I test out the 5x zoom images where the quality remains the same for both phones, but with a similar better contrast levels on the Realme, and the quality of the 10x zoom on the Realme was also way better. Now, as for the portrait mode, edge detection on the Realme was flawless, where in this image you can see that the Poco did not do a great job at the top edge of Lee Hood's cap, but most of the time it was fine. And once again, the image coming out from the Realme was more vibrant straight out of the camera. Now, the background details were also better on this close-up image on the Realme, where you can see better details on the sky area compared to the Poco F3, which was totally blown out. And where the Poco F3 totally fails is during a backlit situation, where the subject was totally underexposed as the phone was trying to get more dynamic range on the background instead of the subject instead, where the Realme did a better job over here. Then as for the ultra-wide lens, both images produced on the phone were identical to each other with the same amount of great quality, focal length with no barrel distortion on the edges, but there were times where the images on the Realme had more saturation on the image. Then looking at the macro mode shots, both had easier focusing during this mode. Now on the Realme GT Neo 2, instead of a macro mode, is called ultra macro mode, where it was just macro mode on the Poco F3. Now, names aside, overall the shots on the Poco F3 was better as it had a better overall image quality due to the higher megapixel count, and the images was also sharper and more focused in the middle of the image, where the sides were a bit more blur, and the color accuracy on the Poco F3 was even better. So if you like to take macro shots, the Poco F3 would be a definite better choice, but for me, I don't really use the macro mode anyway. Now, as for the night mode, for the ultra-wide lens, both had similar results, where the night lights were a bit more spread out on the Poco, making it a lesser of a nicer image compared to the Realme. Then as for the main lenses during at night, the images processed better on the Realme, as it had an even better detail overall, as seen in this first image, where the lights had this sort of a glare on the Poco F3 compared to a sharper image on the Realme GT Neo 2. And the color accuracy of the skies were even better at night on the Realme GT Neo 2 as well. Next, looking at the selfie shots. For the regular selfie mode, while both images look great, but I do prefer the more natural skin tones that the Poco F3 produced. But the dynamic range on the Realme GT Neo 2 was better on the background area, where you can see it at the cloud area on this second image. Then as for the portrait selfie, the edge detection on the Poco is just a little better than the Realme image. And the overall saturation was also nicer, and this makes me wonder why didn't Poco do the same image processing for the rear camera like how they did it for the front camera. Are they saying that the rear camera is not as important? Let's wait and see for a new software update. Then as for video recording, the Poco F3 maximizes at 4K 30 frames per second, but the Realme GT Neo 2 can go up to 60 frames per second at 4K resolution. Now the quality on the video was great on both, where the results were the same as the pictures, where the video footage on the Realme was a bit more vibrant overall, and the dynamic range of the skies were also a bit better on the Realme as well. And when it comes to image stabilization, as seen over here, both were really good as well. Then footage for the ultra-wide lenses for both phones maximizes at 1080p up to 30 frames per second. But once again, you can go up to 60 frames per second on the Realme, where the video quality was still good with similar dynamic range, and the image stabilization over here was really great as well. Then as for the front video recording, here's where things get a little weird. Because now, the Poco can record up to 60 frames per second at 1080p, where the Realme can go up to only 30 frames per second. Now, while the image stabilization was better on the Poco F3, but that was because by default, the stabilization is turned off on the Realme GT Neo 2, so you will need to turn it on in case you forget. Whereas seen in this first footage, it was turned off, and once it turned on, it was great, but from a skin tone to the overall dynamic range, it was still better on the Poco F3. And if you're looking at the microphone quality when using these both phones for vlogging situations, here is a quick microphone recording test when using this phone, especially with the front camera as well. This is an audio recording of the GT Neo 2 on the Realme, test 1 2, test 1 2. And this is an audio recording on the Poco F3. So let's see how exactly it is. So with this, let me know, do you think the Poco F3 or the Realme GT Neo 2 perform better in every aspect of the cameras? A little tricky, right? Let me know what you think at the comment section below. And if you're enjoying this video so far, a nice big thumbs up would be very much appreciated. And if you haven't subscribed to Adam Lobo TV, that would be very much appreciated. So, go on. Thank you. Now in terms of both phone speakers, both has dual speakers, where as mentioned, the Poco F3 has the secondary speaker on top of the phone compared to it coming out from the earpiece area on the Realme GT Neo 2. Now in terms of the loudness, not only that the Poco was louder at 95.5 dB compared to the Realme, which was at 95.3 dB, but also the audio quality was better on the Poco F3 as it had more bass in the speaker. And yes, here is a quick sound test for each phone. Now as for the battery specs, the Poco F3 comes with a 4520 milliamps of battery, whereas the Realme GT Neo 2 comes with a bigger 5000 milliamps of battery. So, does size matter in this case? Oh yes, it does, because the Realme GT Neo 2 gave me up to a massive 10 hours and 22 minutes of screen on time with dark mode turned on when I was at 10% battery compared to 7 hours on the Poco F3 with the same settings. And the Realme GT Neo 2 is better on the fast charging up to 65 watts compared to 33 watts on the Poco F3, where the Realme GT Neo 2 got me from 0 to 100% a little more than 30 minutes, whereas the Poco F3 gave me half of that. But guys, do let me know what you think, or which one do you prefer, a better screen on time or a better fast charging on the phones? Let me know once again at the comment section below. So the current software version that I was at during this review for the Poco F3 is MIUI version 12.5.7 with the Poco skin of course, and the Realme GT Neo 2 was at Realme UI version 2.0. Now by default, I have to say that I love both of the rounded icons on the phones compared to the square ones that you get from other smartphones. And while I did not have any issues when using the softwares on the phone daily, but if I really had to choose, I would go with the Realme GT Neo 2, and here's why. Now firstly is the menu system, where I still prefer how straightforward it was, where for example, if I want to set the auto screen off duration, naturally you'd find that on the display settings, but that is how it is on the Realme UI. But for the Poco F3, you'll need to go on the settings on the always on display and the lock screen in order to access that. And I also love how there are more flexible options on the Realme UI, like adjusting the screen refresh rate on several settings as mentioned earlier. Then there are shortcuts like pressing the power button and the top volume rocker to quickly change the phone to vibrate mode for messages and phone calls compared to typically going on the control center. Then there's also the software RAM expansion that can go up to an additional 7GB. Then there are other smaller adjustments like activating the GT mode to increase the phone's performance, which I never came to a point of really needing to use it, but it's nice that it's there. And finally, whether or not I'm using the phone for multitasking or just playing games, there was never a point of time where the phone overheated too. And speaking of playing games, this brings me to my next topic, which is of course gaming on both phones. Now as for gaming, as usual, I started out Genshin Impact on the Poco F3, and the previous software update has been a great help when it comes to the overall thermals for playing games for a really long time, as there was no significant difference between the previous update and now, which is all good. So as how it was before, the game ran very smoothly without any lags or issues at medium settings, 60 frames per second and motion blur turned off. And it did get a bit warm but not too hot to the touch in 20 minutes of gameplay, and the performance during the normal or the ultimate animation commands was really stable when performing each of the commands. Then as for PUBG Mobile, the settings were at UHD on the graphics and the frame rate were at Ultra with no battery drain or heating issues when playing it continuously for close to a half an hour or more. Next, look at the Realme GT Neo 2 on Genshin Impact. The overall settings were the same at medium settings, 60 frames per second and motion blur turned off, where the overall animation feels fluid, smooth, and I was really surprised by the great battery performance, where the battery barely moved from 88% to 81% with non-stop gaming of 30 minutes on the game. Then the overall thermals were a tad bit better than the Poco F3, and gaming on the phone also felt very good in the hands too. Then as for PUBG Mobile, the playing experience was identical to the Poco F3 with the same exact settings, where once again the overall thermals and the battery drain were at their minimal, and the game controls during gameplay was also comfortable in the hands. So overall, when it comes to a gaming's perspective, I would give the edge to the Realme GT Neo 2, even though both performed pretty similar when it comes to the gaming performance. So in conclusion, this is seriously a hard one to choose compared to other comparison that I've did with the Poco F3, because the design and using both phones daily was very similar. Gaming on both was still really nice, battery performance was also really good on both phones, but of course Realme would beat it from a charging perspective. And the overall camera performance were a bit tricky because the rear cameras on the Realme GT Neo 2 performed better, and I like how the performance was on the front camera on the Poco F3. As of making of this video, the Poco F3 is priced at 1,699 ringgit for the 8GB of RAM and 256GB of storage. And the Realme GT Neo 2 retails at 2,099 ringgit, but it comes with a higher 12GB of RAM but with the same storage variant. So yes, this does come down to what you really need on your smartphone based on all the comparison that I've done in this video. So with all of this, do let me know which one of these two phones that you would choose. Please let me know and comment at the comment section below. And speaking of comparison videos, as you all know that I've been comparing lots of smartphones with the Poco F3, so let me know whether or not it's time for me to retire the Poco F3 when it comes to comparison videos, or if there's any other smartphones that you would like for me to compare with the Poco F3. Meanwhile, do check out these two comparison videos in case you haven't seen it. My name is Adam Lobo and I'll see you in my next video.